They were vulnerable young girls who were just out walking around, and he had a type, and he was constantly cruising. Nobody expected this. Like, even when Norma is in the van, he's got a knife to her throat, and she says, "Are you really going to do this?"
Today, we are joined by Carolyn Ossorio of the new hit podcast, Stolen Voices of Dole Valley. This is a really interesting conversation, Lance, about a serial killer and a lot of victims. What'd you think of this conversation?
Just love the work that Carolyn has put into this, and I love the work that the production companies have put into it as well. Like, standing behind the way she wants to tell these stories. You got Lemonada Media, Pie in the Sky, KSL Podcast. They all came together to get these stories out there. It's not just a story about a forgotten or an unknown serial killer, this individual, Warren Leslie Forrest, this absolutely brutal human being, but it's more the story of the survivors and the victims and what we always talk about, the secondary victims, the ripple effect of what these crimes do to families and friends years and years after they have been perpetrated. I was riveted the entire time. What did you think?
It's a great listen, and Carolyn is the journalist to tell these stories, so we really appreciate her doing what she does and joining us here on the show to discuss this story. It's wild.
So if you want to listen to Stolen Voices of Dole Valley and find out more about the podcast, about all the stories, you can go to kslpodcast.com. Stolen Voices of Dole Valley is right there.
All right, so please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Carolyn Ossorio.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Carolyn Ossorio. How are you today?
I'm so happy to be here. You guys are so fun. I think we're going to have a good time. I love our pre-gaming. We were talking about CrimeCon. I think there's lots of meat on this bone.
I think, like, some people you just tell you're going to hit it off with, and I feel that here. So very cool. We really want to talk about Stolen Voices. It's fantastic. Well done.
Thank you.
I'm sure you talked to thousands of people at CrimeCon over the weekend, but there's some people out there who need an introduction. So if you don't mind just introducing yourself, a little bit about your background, a little bit about what brings you on the show.
Yeah. So my name's Carolyn Ossorio. I'm a Seattle journalist and the host of Stolen Voices of Dole Valley. It's a 9-part series about a serial killer I'd never heard of in Washington State, which is saying a lot. As you know, we're like infamous for kind of the breeding grounds of serial killers. But what really brought me to want to investigate and a 2-year deep dive sojourn to Clark County, Washington, where this story takes place, which is 3 hours away from Seattle, where I live, one way, is the victims and the survivors. There are so many heroes in this story. So although it is absolutely dark and scary and haunting, and you're going to get mad and you're going to be just sad, you're also going to be inspired. As a journalist, those are the kinds of stories that I look for and I gravitate towards people who have grit and who have perseverance and who never give up. And all of those people are in this series, including the investigators, prosecutors who've come out of retirement, and just the community. So it's a lot to unpack, and that's why we have 9 episodes.
Awesome. And you did say that it's a 2-year journey that you went on, but I feel like it's a little longer, right? It's a 2-year journy from like starting production, right? How long has this been on your mind to do as a narrative series? So
I was doing a regional true crime pod. Okay, so full circle. I was worked for a popular news and talk radio station in Seattle, Cairo Radio. And at that, in 2018, I was hosting the 5 a.m., which is brutal. You have to wake up like way early in the morning. And we were promoting a podcast called Cold. And it was about the Susan Cox Powell case. And, at that point in my life, I never really kind of admitted what a true crime fan that I was, because it kind of felt weird to me. And why am I interested in Jerry Brutos, the Lust Killer, when I was like 18 years old? Why am I reading this? I felt wrong. So when I heard Cold Podcast, which is hosted by Dave Cawley, I was blown away by how good it was and the deep dive, long form storytelling that I absolutely love, because in news, it's like, it's a new story every single second. And I just love diving in. So I was like, I want to do that. And when I do that, I really want to do it as well. That was the bar that I kind of set for myself. So in 2019, I left Cairo Radio, started a regional true crime podcast, and just got my feet wet, because really you have to have something to say. You can't just be like, I like true crime, this was a horrible case, right? You need to understand, especially like investigative genetic genealogy and investigators. Unfortunately, I had a bunch of sources, locally and with like detectives, and because of my reporting work. So I really spent the last, from 2019 until now, learning how to be a true crime podcast host and having something to say and sharing these voices and stories that I feel like, are really compelling. And I always think, if you tell a story so well and share that person, what they went through, it's going to resonate with people. And so that's what whenever I go into something, that's what I'm always trying to do.
Great. Well done with everything in regards to that, because this is definitely resonating with us as we listen to Stolen Voices. And can you tell us a little bit about Dole Valley? Where does this story take place?
Yeah, the story takes place in Clark County, Washington, which is on the border of Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. Warren Forrest was we've kind of doled out the information because we didn't want to say his name until we didn't want to make it about the serial killer. We wanted to make it about the victims and stay true to the timeline. But it's a rural community, really tight though, like a lot of rural communities are. And Portland is the big city. And so Dole Valley, we've narrowed in on that as a part of the title, because there were 2 victims who were found, and then a girl named Jamie Grissom, who is believed to be in Dole Valley. So there are other victims around the county. And the thing is that he was a parks employee. So he had this specialty key to get into all of these parks. And that's where he would take his victims. And so like Norma Jean Countryman, who, her story, well, you've heard it. You can't unhear it. She was 15 years old, sitting on the side of the road during the summertime, bored, not doing anything, smoking cigarettes. And this guy, good looking guy in a blue van, comes up, and she knew that when he asked if he could give her a ride, she was like, no. And he just kind of manipulated and pushed, and he ended up kidnapping her, carrying her into one of these parks that he had the specialty key to, tying her between 2 trees. And he had to leave for some reason, but he sucker punched her in the eye. So her eye was literally blood red, the entire white, and bound her, hog-tied her between these 2 trees. And it's so hard to describe and imagine, but imagine your hands tied behind your back and then tied up to your legs, and then your head tied, gagged and bound to a tree. And she chewed through her bindings to escape. And she was able to bunny hop out of there, and he came back looking for her, and she spent the night in a meadow. She was so exhausted, and she goes to the Clark County Parks, maintenance building. And when they find her and they call the police, she wasn't believed. In the interview, I don't know how this landed on you, but like when they announced it, in the recording as an interrogation, I just lost it. I have daughters, I was 15 once, and, she was so composed, and yet she wasn't believed. And so he was allowed to basically go on to kill more. And that's the layers of this story, because 4 months later, he conned another young woman into getting into his van, and she barely escaped. And he, left her for dead, stabbed her multiple times, slashed her throat, and she was able to get to the road. And by staunching her wounds with leaves, and she was believed. So like, why was she believed and Norma wasn't? So there's so many questions like that, that we touch. And that's what's great about having Lemonada and KSL Podcast as producing partners is they're so women focused, and every meeting, like with Lemonada, it was so, I mean, hey, I love guys, don't get me wrong, but like every meeting is like all these like brilliant women, and they want to elevate the space into these Trojan horses, or a Trojan horse for these other societal issues, and do it in a way of like amazing storytelling. So that's the goal.
Goal achieved with this. And you just said, like, I don't know how this landed on you guys when you heard it, but this is how it landed on me when you hear that she's not believed by law enforcement. I have to remind myself that this is the 70s, right?
Yeah. So
I'm like, oh, well, times have changed, and they've changed so much. Like, that would never happen today.
Right. I love your irony. I know.
Well, I loved how you went into the reactions to trauma, and how, you can't really take one person's reaction as evidence in another person's story. So I thought that was quite interesting and profound. Yeah.
It's interesting with Deputy Pillsbury, because my producing partner, Brandon Morgan from Pie in the Sky Media, we were roundtabling the very first episode, and he was like, I want you to write this from Pillsbury's perspective. I mean, if you see the look on my face, you can see that I was like, there's just no way I can do it. There's no way. But it was a great exercise, because for me, context is everything. You can tell he feels horrible about what happened. He's lived the last 30 years. He almost gets close to just fully on apologizing and saying, I messed up, he said, if I would have gone back and seen that van, a couple more women wouldn't have died, and another one barely survived. Right. But he just can't, but he's like, my gut, he just couldn't kind of get over that line, and I think that, again, it's like to tell the story in a way from his perspective, like, he feels horrible, but, he messed up, And I think that that's important for Norma's story, because, this has never been, the cases have never been in the national spotlight, and that's what's happening now. And so if for nothing else, Norma's getting a chance to tell her story.
And we just mentioned the 70s. Can you just take us back to that area, which you described really nicely in the beginning, but what was the 70s like in that area?
From what I understand from the people who live there, Portland was like the big city. That's where all the crime happened. And like multiple investigators that I interviewed, retired detectives who were there in the 70s, they all just couldn't believe that they would have a serial killer. It was just not, now it's everywhere. We know about Ted Bundy, we know about Gary Ridgway and all these others. And so it's very much, popular culture in the zeitgeist. But back then it really wasn't, it's so long ago. There was that bias of like small town mentality of like, they just didn't see. And if they did, they didn't want to believe that that there could be someone doing that, until it was so obvious that it just hit him in the face. And then by that time, it was like, oh my gosh, this was years later. From the people that I interviewed who were there and were teenagers, it's the same thing that we've heard. If you watch documentaries, it was like free love. It was like hitchhiking. Everybody was doing it, recreational drug use. People were really finding themselves. And that's who these people were. They were vulnerable young girls who were just out walking around, and he had a type, and he was constantly cruising. So it's like, nobody expected this. Like, even when Norma is in the van, he's got a knife to her throat, and she says, are you really going to do this? It's not like it is today, I don't think. I think there was more of an innocence. Of course, bad things happen, but really they happen somewhere else. But we now know that, oh no, they were happening there. It's just that there was no social media, there was no cell phones, there was just, they literally in the 80s, they had, do you know where your children are? And that was in the 80s. This is back in the 70s.
Yeah, I even feel like back in the 70s, young adults would just leave for a while. Yeah. And that would be fine. Like parents would be fine with that, depending on the area. And also like the type of upbringing and stuff. Did that factor into some of these stories?
Well, I still feel like there is that for sure. But like in the case of Jamie Grissom, his first believed victim, in the same way that I was upset by Norma's story and wanted to shout it from the rooftops, and she wanted it shouted from the rooftops. But Star is Jamie's sister. They were foster children. They grew up. They only had each other. And they were finally in the same space, in the same home in Minnehaha. And they would walk to Oscar's store. I mean, they were like Irish twins, a year apart, not even a year apart. When Jamie went missing, she told them she would not go missing. She had, $400 in the bank, which is the equivalent of like, 800 now, right? She's a foster kid. If she was going somewhere, she would be taking that money. And they just they wouldn't believe. And so they didn't even go looking for her that night, the police. They told them, come back. They told the the social worker, come back in a month and then we'll report her missing, because that's kind of how they seriously they were taking it. And then of course, 5 months later, again, they found her belongings in Dole Valley, and they're like, oh, okay, maybe something did happen to her. It's heartbreaking because if we think of our loved ones and how she was treated, would any of us, even in the 70s, would any of us want our loved ones treated like that? And her being a foster child on top of it, it's just, it's affected and impacted Star's life in ways that it's hard to quantify. And yet she has never, again, going back to that grit, Star will be a part of solving one of these future crimes. And it's so badass. I can't even tell you about it. I mean, you'll have to wait, but it's crazy.
Do you think that's just like more of a sign of the times, or just like, I don't know, understaff at these police stations?
I mean, I would like to think that it was just being understaffed, but if she was a middle-class cheerleader, would there be posters and ribbons and people looking for her? And, they did that in the 70s. Yeah, I think that it's because she was a foster child. And honestly, like with serial killers like Warren Forrest, that's exactly what he was hoping for. He picked victims that were vulnerable, young girls on their own, not afraid to talk to strangers, not thinking there was a serial killer on every turn, not thinking that, that they could just take a ride and everything would be fine. And he exploited that. And that's what I love about the show, is that he is still alive, and there is still the will, in part because of the podcast. The cold case unit has been reactivated. We brought Paul Holes from, Golden State Killer case. He's helping the sheriff's office. It's just really exciting. Some of the twists and turns that are happening now that I could tease, but I don't want to get too far in there.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors. And now we're back to the program.
The person that you mentioned, the killer, this Warren Forrest.
Yeah.
How have we not heard about him? And also, second question on that, when you were at CrimeCon, how many people knew about him when they approached your table and you started talking about this individual?
One person.
Knew about him?
Who lived in Clark County, and she didn't really know anything about him. The reason why I think that a lot of people don't, or hardly anyone has heard of Warren Forrest, is because he flew under the radar and his story is super complicated. Like, it's really hard to tell. And that's why having partners like KSL, they do the work. I mean, they put the time and resources into like people that have touched this story. Like, it's good, not because of me. It's good because of all the other people that have helped and have listened and have said, okay, I don't understand this. And because he's been in prison for over 30 years. But the journey to get him there and what he did, he's only been convicted of 2. Everything that went on, nobody really knows about, which has been so frustrating for the victims and survivors and family members who are like, they feel like not only has he gotten away with all these crimes, but it's like they've had to live with all this and no one knows what he did. So in essence, there's a lot of fronts here. There's like, can DNA solve some of these crimes? Can they get him to confess by putting pressure on him that, hey, if you don't come clean, you're going to be charged with another murder? He's 76 years old. He does not want to leave prison because he goes back to jail in Clark County. I mean, that's going to be rough for him. And then there's just the exposure of people like now are going to know the name Warren Forrest, because he's not the type of, I've said this many times, and it's the best way I can describe it is that he's not the kind of serial killer who detectives can go in there and plunk down a couple of cheeseburgers and a milkshake, and he'll start like spinning yarns about the good old days and then finally get to one of these crimes because he's a narcissist. I believe he's a narcissist. He's one that doesn't want to talk. He wants to act like he doesn't know anything. He wants to act like he's dumb, and he's not. He is not.
Yeah. I was wondering how many survivors or victims did he create, I suppose?
Okay. So there's some that he's been adjudicated for, and then others that are unsolved. There's 2 young girls that are still missing, have never been found, that they believe that he's suspected of killing. Jamie Grissom and Diane Gilchrist. Gloria Knudsen, she was found 4 years after she disappeared in 1974, and she's attributed to his case, but there's no physical evidence tying him to her. But we did find, through all of my research, some connecting points that, that was the beautiful thing about this, working with Clark County, and how I like to work with law enforcement if I can on an investigation like this. When I would find things in all these documents, I would talk to them and say, hey, here's something that I found. Because these kinds of cases, 50 years, there's not one person that knows everything about the case. It's kind of a misnomer to think that. They've had people dedicated and they know pieces of it. But stringing together like witnesses who were never talked to. We're now looking for this guy named Matt McClure, who we believe witnessed. He saw a young woman tied between 2 trees in Dole Valley around the time Jamie went missing, but he was never interviewed by police. Like they called the sheriff's office, and she was bloody and screaming. And they came out, supposedly they came out that night. I haven't found a police report. I don't know if one exists or it got destroyed, which happens, in a 50-year case, but he was never talked to. And so I went out on a canine search of Dole Valley recently because they're still trying to find Jamie out there. They believe that she's out there. So really finding if he saw Jamie, if it was Jamie, where, so then these dogs know where to sniff and try to find her remains. And so 2 missing people, Gloria Knudsen, which they found her remains, and then Carol Valenzuela, who was found near Martha Morrison, who was recently, that case was adjudicated in 2023. Lots of twists and turns with that story. They're hoping to charge him, with that murder. But they believe he has other victims in other states. Again, he doesn't talk about his crimes, but there's a lot there. And we're hoping that, for example, his ex-wife, who was married to him at the time that he was arrested, she didn't agree to have an interview. I talked to her briefly. And then at just a couple months ago, she reached out and was like, okay, I'm ready to talk. She understands that this is going to be pretty, a lot of eyeballs were going to be on this. And I think, she wanted to. She's working to help him. She believes that his soul can be saved. And so she's trying to get him to confess from that angle. So who knows if that will work, but there's just a lot of pressure on this guy.
Wow, that's really interesting. I can't wait to get to that part in the podcast. You mentioned that eyewitness account. Mm-hmm. Can you take us through that account a little bit? It definitely sounds pretty wild and almost too hard to believe at first, but because of the rest of the story, it's totally believable.
It's insane because, again, it's like one of those things where it's hard to wrap your head around. But so in Dole Valley, there was a family, the McClure family. And this area is really known for, and this is not me saying this is from the interviewer, people that I interviewed. It's not really, it's very suspicious of strangers and outsiders, very remote, total wilderness. Like when you go out there, it's iffy if there's going to be a cell connection, even to this day, right? And so I found out through just talking to people and then reading documents, there was a guy a young 19-year-old, Matt McClure, and this is the lore. I haven't been able to confirm this, only with an account of his sister-in-law, who said that her future husband, when he was like 12, and then Matt McClure, who was older, like older teenager, they were at this trapper's cabin that their family owned. And he got in a fight with his dad. And so Matt left the cabin and he started walking by Rock Creek Bridge. And he heard a young woman screaming, and he followed those screams and found her tied between two trees, bloody. Now, he left the scene, went back to the trapper's cabin, and the brother told his future wife that it happened. The dad, it was like lore within the generations of the family, but they called the sheriff's office. They took him to where those two trees are, but nothing happened. They never put a search out. They never were like, hey, let's go talk to neighbors. Let's see what's happening here. It was just like, oh, well, she's not here anymore. And so he was never talked to. Even through all of this investigation, even when they uncovered Jamie's belongings 5 months later, like they never went out and said, hey, there was a report. If there was a report at the time, which I don't know if there was because I couldn't find it, they never went back. And if they would have went back, they would have found these other neighbors who heard screams at around the same time, like horrible screams that echoed through the wilderness, that it was a snowstorm and the snow was piled high. The dad went out and started looking and saw these headlights, and he kind of slid into he had a Volkswagen Bug, and he slid into the embankment. And so he couldn't follow the truck. They believe that could be Jamie Grissom. So that's one of the angles that I identified through the research. Went to law enforcement and said, hey, 50 years later, hey, this is what I found. This is who I talked to. And they followed that up. They put out a blast on their social media to say, hey, this is a witness. We want to talk to you about this, but he does not want to be found. He is still alive, but he doesn't want to be found. And so, and this is kind of breaking news, recently somebody called out on social media and to the sheriff's office that they see Matt McClure every day. The sheriff's office is following up on that. As soon as they know anything, they said that they will let me know. So stay tuned. But that could be so exciting, because if they can pinpoint, was that Jamie? Does he remember the description? I mean, I know it's 50 years, but you would remember something like that. Most people would, right?
Remember it or block it, one or the other, I think.
Yeah,
right?
Completely block it, yeah.
Just one final thing, just to run it down. That's the thing that drives me, is like, you know what? Maybe he doesn't know anything. Okay. But like the fact that he was never talked to, it's like, let's tie that loose thread.
Yeah. I'm curious what your relationship is with law enforcement and how you introduced it to them. Sounds like you have a really good relationship, or at least a productive relationship with law enforcement right now. Do they ever acknowledge to you that this could have been handled differently?
They have. And it didn't start out that way.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it did with these cold case investigators. It's my experience that if you do the work and people are not bad actors, they're going to want to work with you. If they see that you really want to bring closure or not closure, because, there's never fully closure for, family members, but some kind of resolution, possibly justice. And so when I first reached out, so I was talking to these sources, retired detectives, all that. So I was getting kind of the scoop. It took me probably about 8 months just to understand what was happening in this case. And then it was like there was missing pieces. So I waited until the trial was over in 2023, where he was convicted of Martha Morrison. And then I waited about 6 months, and I reached out to the guy that I knew was in charge of the investigation, although nobody was working the cases, because that latest trial pretty much broke the bank and it was kind of like, we're done. He's not getting out of prison. But there were all these unanswered questions, missing people that needed to be found, murder cases that needed to be solved. And so I reached out to him. I was like, hey, I'm Carolyn. This is what I'm doing. I'm a Seattle journalist. And I was like, I want to work with you guys, just this typical kind of boilerplate, interview request. And he got right back to me and he was like, no, we're busy. And I get that, I believe that. And then I just thought, well, we'll see, we'll see. And so I just kept doing the work, kept doing the research. I knew small town and used that to my advantage, that I knew word was going to spread, that I kept going there and I kept interviewing people. And it's just human nature. When someone's not going away, you kind of have to deal with them. And so that's what they did. And once, we had our first meeting, and then I found some evidence related to Barbara Derry's case. Barbara Derry's case is still unsolved as well. So Gloria Knudsen, Barbara Derry, and Carol Valenzuela, those murder cases have not been found. So there's 5 cases they are pressuring him to confess to. So I went there because I found some evidence that hadn't been sent to the lab. And I was like, okay, let's sit down and talk about it. And Sergeant Neiman agreed to this sit down interview. And I could have asked more questions, but I could tell that, he was frustrated that they didn't have the resources to pursue these cases. You can tell, when you're talking to someone. And you can tell if it's genuine. I mean, of course, you can be wrong, but that was my sense. I knew at that time there was also these van hairs that they swept his van back in the 70s. And I knew that they hadn't been tested because by the time I'd gotten to that point, but I didn't ask him about it then. What I was there for was basically to establish some trust, to show him that I'd found this other evidence in this other case, build that relationship and ask, hey, would you be willing, if I can find qualified investigators to help, would you be willing to talk with them? And he said yes. And so that's when I knew in the back of my mind, okay, Paul Holes, because I talked with Paul Holes on a couple of other cases and I knew he'd be able to help them. I knew, he just is just amazing. So that's kind of my process, is like the slow roll on something like this.
I don't know if you meant to do it, but the fact that you listened to your instincts when he did get back to you just to say no, because if he really didn't want to pursue it, I feel like there would have been no answer. Do you feel like he knew he had to say no right away, but he was responding just to keep the line of communication open because he, in the back of his mind, was like, maybe she could help?
I think that law enforcement and media, there is not trust. It's good that we're not trusting of each other in the sense of like, we have a job to do to report what happens, and they have a job to do to protect the case and not let leaks ruin it and, that kind of stuff. But I do think that in cases like this, you can come together for a common goal. I think that he was suspicious and was like, I don't want to give my time to this podcaster. Who are you? I'm someone from Seattle. I'm not even local. But I think he said, now that I'm thinking about it, later in one of the interviews or one of the times we were just kind of chatting, he was like, there was a local person there who had heard a podcast that I had done called The Shadow Girls, and it was a deep dive into the Green River Killer investigation. And in that case, I also worked with, interviewed tons of the retired detectives and victims' families and the advocacy. And again, the work kind of speaks for itself, when people take the time to say, okay, who is this person that's in front of me? So I think that, if I was someone that he could immediately just dismiss and was going away, then, problem solved. He could say like, hey, I responded. I think that it could have gone either way. But for me, that's just fuel. Like I knew I was going to get there somehow.
See, personally, I think that you had this intuition that response anyway was a little bit of a window, like a little bit of an open door, just a slight open door. Hey,
it was a pinky toe. Toe. I knew that once I did the work, I knew it because like, it wasn't nasty. It wasn't like, we're too busy, go away, which I've had, what fuels it is getting the information to tell the story so you can tell a better story. It's not to point fingers. Because like in the show, I say, I have had so much help from retired detectives, from current detectives, from people all over. But we're going to point out things that happened. We're going to tell it as fairly and accurately as we can with the documents that we were given and the people that we talked to.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
We mentioned Warren Forrest and some of the victims not being well known. That can't be said for DB Cooper.
Yeah. So it was kind of crazy because yet another little piece, I'm like, DB Cooper, how does he come into play? So DB Cooper, for those who don't know, which I'm sure everybody does, but he hijacked a plane in 1971, November 1971. He ripcorded out of there with $200,000 cash. And the FBI, based on the trajectory, thought, oh, he could land somewhere by the grist mill where Barbara Derry's remains were found. But, they hadn't been found at that time. So they'd been searching those woods. And again, that horrible snowstorm, that patch of weather that was just, at that time period, they were searching and it made it so hard. So by springtime, they started searching again. And that's when a couple of kids were throwing rocks at this old abandoned silo, this grist mill, which is so scary and had like a kind of lore in and of itself as a place where people go to teenagers go to party at night. It was abandoned. It was super creepy. But during the day, it was this beautiful place with this. And I've been out there and it is beautiful during the day. A chunk of the silo was rotting and it fell out and it fell off. And then all of a sudden this hand dropped out. And so at first there was all this debris on top of the remains and they had to saw out a chunk of the silo because it's a huge silo. And during that time period, the FBI got wind of this and they're like thinking, oh, this could be DB Cooper. Like maybe he dropped out. It was so funny. The detective was like, well, he didn't jump through to the silo. It's not like he from the airplane, but that maybe he had an accomplice who had pushed him down into the silo and taken the money. So that was kind of their thought process. And so as they were, having the army come out and, saw away at this silo and they pulled the victim out. And then once they took off she had been piled on garbage on her and they saw, oh, it's just a girl. And that's why we titled the episode of like, oh, it's just a girl. We're out of here. That, again, was another frustrating piece because when we talk about serial killers, that time period is exactly when the FBI was putting together their, infamous behavioral science unit. If the FBI was already sort of tangentially involved thinking it was DB Cooper, Clark County, what if they would have invited them in and said, hey, help? And then they would have, used one of their profilers to potentially maybe go talk to those witnesses in Dole Valley. Are there any other girls that went missing? Like it could have gone a different way. But I mean, maybe that's the Hollywood version, because the real version was like, just a girl. We're out of here.
One of the most harrowing stories that you told in the show was that of Susan. And I don't want you to give too much of it away because it does unfold very cinematically in the series. But can you give us a little bit on Susan's story? Yeah,
Susan's story is diametrically opposed in a way to Norma's story. Because whereas Norma is an advocate. She wants to tell her story and has told her story and she wants people to know. Susan does not want to be known in the public eye for what happened. And that just shows that victims and survivors can be completely different and you have to respect where they're at. But Susan plays such a pivotal role in this that we, of course, had to tell her story, but do it in a way where we could try to protect her privacy as much as possible. And that's why it's a pseudonym. And we refer to her also as the Lacamas Lake victim. So Norma was kidnapped and abducted and got away in July of 1974. In October 1st, Susan was, had just gotten back to Clark County. She'd been living in Europe on studying abroad. She was just awesome, taking a gap year. She was volunteering. She was really into environmentalism. And she's walking from one volunteer job in downtown Portland to another. And she is like, you know what? I'm going to go to the sunny side of the street because it's, kind of rainy and kind of, overcast in this area. And she's clocked a guy. And this is like women's instincts and what we have to kind of, you guys do true crime. So this, that instinct. She saw a guy on the other side and she's like, I know if I go over there, he's probably going to try to talk to me, but I want to get to the sunny side. So I'm just going to say hi and maybe make his day. Right. So she does that and he stops her. So her instinct was absolutely on, he was going to talk to her and he's like, hey, I'm a photography student. I have a shoot that I need to do. Can I pay you to be a model? She kind of thought about it, sized him up. He didn't appear to be a threat. He was this good looking guy, but, so she said, yeah. So they drive to Washington Park, but he stops, makes a detour as he's pretending to get his, photographic equipment out. She's kind of doing her hair. And then she realizes, oh, he's going to abduct me. He hog ties her into the back of this van and drives her all over the place and then takes her to one of these parks, the Lacamas Lake Park. She sees him utilizing his specialty key, but she didn't know where she was. So she didn't know that it was a park and she didn't know what he was, what he was planning on doing. But he hogtied her. And so that's the thing. That's why we have rope really featured in this show, because that was in his kill kit. Like, he had this obsession with hog tying and tying them in these weird, like, slabs of meat. She was tied in the back of the van and he was a sexual sadist. And so he loved to torture them with, like, driving them around there in fear. And that's exactly what he does. Once they pull in, he does this horrific rape and torture. He shoots dart guns into her chest over and over again. And, the way I describe it, because I listened to her interview when back in the 70s, that's what's so cool too, is we have these interview tapes from back in the 70s. So you really get an idea of kind of in their own words, it's just so powerful. There's nothing I can say that's more powerful than them delivering it themselves. When he pointed the dart gun at her, she thought it was a real gun. She thought it was, she was dead. And then he pulled the trigger and just was feasting on her fear. And that's what he was about, And so then he takes her into the woods, again, ties these ropes around. She thinks it's a noose or that he's going to choke her out, but it's a slip knot. So it falls off. So he does this like cat and mouse thing. And then he ends up, stabbing her, choking her out, leaving her there, and, thinks that she's dead, piles debris on top of her and takes off. And she wakes up after, this is like the third time he's choked her unconscious. And she's bleeding from these chest wounds. She's bleeding from the neck. And she's able to slowly make her way out of these woods. Like I said, staunching her wounds with leaves and, pausing to take a breath, like every few steps, knowing that she doesn't have a lot of time left. She knows she's leaking blood. She knows that she's going in and out of consciousness herself as she's walking. And she puts her thumb out totally naked on the side of the road. And first a couple of times pass by her. And then these good Samaritans pick her up. She's rushed to the hospital. They immediately, everything they didn't do in Norma's case, they did in her case. The first officer on the scene saw that this van, one of the witnesses had stayed behind to say, hey, yes, this woman, survived this horrific rape. There was this van, inside the park. He saw this gate and he's like, okay, well, it's locked now. How is the van in there? He put it together that you must have somebody had a specialty key. They went and talked to the parks department, which they hadn't done in Norma's case. And they're like, hey, does somebody work here who has a specialty key, drives a van, is good looking and has a bushy mustache with, shallooling blondish brown hair. And then they arrested him the next morning. So it was like a totally different experience. The travesty of that is that he would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, would never be charged with Norma's crimes, and was sent to a mental hospital. That's where the frustration comes, because he has been in prison all this time, but people feel like he's just gotten away with so much.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about this specialty key and how his job came into play with the crimes that he committed? Yeah.
So he was a Parks Department employee. And one of the things about Warren Forrest through my research is that he portrayed himself after he was caught as someone who was not bright, who didn't have a lot of friends. In one of these reports I read, his best friend was like a 4x4 post where he would take it with him. Like, it was just ridiculous, right? Because then he would there would be other people, other interviews that I saw where it was like he was the captain of his track team. That was a voted position. He had a lot of friends. He had a girlfriend. He was not this loner as he tried to portray himself. And we can see this time and time again where the park employees after Norma was abducted, because they found her on the stoop at one of their offices. And so they were like, when they heard that, when the gossip happened immediately, oh my gosh, did you hear this girl was found on the doorstep? Oh my gosh, it sounds like the way she described it was like Warren Forrest. But they never went to the police. They didn't want to get him in trouble, and it's like, why would you not go to the police? So you can see that time and time again with his personality of wooing people over, portraying himself as something that he wasn't, and getting people on his side. He did that at Western State Mental Hospital when they went to try to arrest him there. The staff was like they almost got in an altercation with the police trying to defend not wanting him to be taken. He had all these crazy privileges when he was there. He had a vehicle. He was off site. And the first 3 weeks that he was there, one of the patients, Karen Wiles, who, and this is going to drop in episode 5. So it's crazy. Her case is still unsolved. She was found 10 miles away at the tide flats. And there was all this hanky sex going on between patients, and it was rumored that he was having an affair with one of the staff members. So we really get into that in episode 5 because Karen's case is still unsolved, and they never really fully were able to do an investigation because the hospital staff just didn't let them go and do interviews. I mean, it's just one thing. So to get back to his, I know your faces are like, what? I know that's what I was going to say. This case will drive you mad, but then when you hear about the people behind it and how now it's all coming to light, there's just that collective feeling of like, okay, there's going to be some justice happening here. But, he was just this Clark County Parks employee. He had access, all of them got these specialty keys, maybe like a week before Norma was abducted. This is where he would take his victims, and he had access and he would go there. And the crazy thing too, and this is getting a little bit ahead, but just because we're talking about the Parks Department, where Norma had been tied 2 years after that abduction and she wasn't believed, they found a victim who had been there all along, 169 feet away in a shallow grave. Krista Blake. She'd been there when Norma had brought the detectives back and begged them to believe, like, this is, or the deputy back there rather, these are the 2 trees where I was tied. Krista Blake was there. He killed her a week before. Not only did they not believe Norma, but like when she brought them to the trees and is like, believe me, there was a dead girl right there.
That's unbelievable.
I know, right?
And I don't understand how he was sent to a mental institution, because even just keeping a job, I feel like I don't know how long he had that job, but isn't that like some kind of evidence that he's not?
He, like I said, he was very adept, and I've never interviewed him. I sent him a couple interview requests and he got back and was like, no. He had this dual nature. The way that he portrayed himself to the people that he was talking to, the interview, after he was caught, was vastly different from this other side of him. And so I believe he got out of there. Again, it was like he was able to persuade, and it was the times. And there's still no understanding how this happened, because I talked to the retired prosecutor who was just kind of coming up when this case happened with Susan. He was a rookie prosecutor. And he said, this would never happen today. I can't even explain to you how he got off on this, because the prosecutor at that time didn't even get their own expert forensic psychiatrists to sign off like, yeah, he's guilty by reason of, or innocent by reason of insanity. But they took the defense's word for it. The defense hired 3 experts. And they said, yep, he's insane. He was insane at the time that this happened. And the judge signed off on it. And he told them this story. I believe all these are protected documents, so I don't know exactly what he told them. But what I think he said was like, I was in Vietnam. He was there for like a couple of months. And he had told people that he had been directed to kill a child with this, to shoot her down with his weapon. And he did that. And that kind of was like his, maybe that's why I'm crazy kind of thing. I think that's what he did. And it was very effective because it worked. There's no evidence that he killed this child, at least none that has come to the surface in his military records.
Was that because, in your opinion, the Vietnam War was so fresh in people's memories? And I feel like everybody at that time was coming to realize the horror that actually happened there.
Yes, I think that there was a part of that. This is my personal opinion. I think that it was the times where they didn't want to believe that there was this monster lurking around, that it had to be because he was crazy, quote unquote crazy to do this. He came from a good, quote unquote, good family. Like, he had ticked all the check marks. He didn't have a criminal record. He was was a track star. His parents and his wife at that time were so supportive. And that was the challenge too with this. None of his friends that were still alive would talk to me. Like all of his family members have passed away. He had 2 brothers. And so it was really hard to kind of get into what was going on with his family because, we always want to know, like, did something horrible happen to you as a child? What caused this? But in this case, it seems like from the evidence that I've had, which is not a lot, and the people that I've talked to, the prosecutors and detectives who investigated him, there wasn't anything going on in that family. Like, this is just who he was. The Vietnam story, it was convenient for him to say that. And I just think that people wanted to believe that. They don't want to believe that this is a monster. And we do that, like in true crime and talking to psychiatrists and experts. It's like human beings have this need to have things make sense to them, that it's going to be the guy in the wrinkled raincoat who's the monster, who's the predator, who hurts children. It's not the coach. It's not the priest. It's not the beloved person who works for years to integrate themselves into our lives, and we have no idea that these truly are the monsters, And I think that was Warren Forrest. He portrayed himself as this, like, caught up in this thing, Vietnam. I don't remember anything. I was in a fugue state. I was unhappy in my marriage. I might be gay. And it worked.
Yeah, I think you nailed it when you said he was a narcissist or is a narcissist. It almost seems like he's got like a cult leader mentality, which I think is kind of in line there.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today, and congrats on such an effective podcast and really interesting to listen to as well. So congratulations on that. We'll be listening to the rest of it.
Okay, well, thanks, guys.
Well done.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.